Conor McGregor has become one of the most hated fighters in the UFC, but those videos have already been made, so we're rolling it back today to when Conor was on his come up and what made him so special. Starting off with his electric fights. Nowadays, with many great fighters in the UFC being wrestling based, it's pretty obvious that fans jump to striking as being the more entertaining martial art, and Conor had one of the most unique styles in the history of the UFC. Not to sound like a complete couch coach, but karate style Conor was that dude. In his run to becoming the double champ, he only had 2 fights that went to a decision, and that was against Max Holloway and Nate Diaz, which we'll get more into later, but Conor ending every fight within 2 rounds made fans feel like his fights were something they had to tune into. It's really important to note that besides Chad Mendes, when Conor would win, it wouldn't be like he got tagged or the other guy scored punches. It would literally be the most picture-perfect performance you've ever seen, striking and throwing kicks from angles that you've never seen anyone throw them from. And if you're like, what does this guy know about striking? The answer is nothing. I'm just repeating what Joe Rogan said and take it from him. But jokes aside, watching Conor in the early days was literally like watching someone play the crappy UFC 5 game and spamming a bunch of combos, and it just led to some badass performances. His knockout over Brundage in the first round proved that he wasn't just one step above the competition, but multiple. And his 3-round decision where he wrestled, yes, Conor McGregor wrestled and used to take people down, but it was against Max Holloway, and even though he hit him with crazy strikes and it was impressive, the fight was a bit of a dud and probably the only dud on his run. But I think looking back on it, it's pretty cool though, seeing what both of them have done, but when you actually watch the fight back, it isn't the craziest thing in the world. And before we move on, this weekend Fight Night returns to St. Louis, and my sponsor, Underdog Fantasy, wants to make it a lot more fun. Underdog Fantasy is the easiest place to play fantasy sports. Playing their pick'em game is as simple as selecting higher or lower on fighter stats like significant strikes, fight time, and fantasy points. Make entries of all MMA picks or mix and match across your other favorite sports like the NBA. You can win up to 100 times your money, and it's tons of fun. Underdog is available in 30 plus states, including Florida, California, Texas, and even Canada. Here are my picks for this weekend's fights, and new customers can pair that with Anthony Edwards to go higher than 1 point. All he has to do is have at least 1 point and you win that selection. Make sure you sign up with code Quiche to claim your special and deposit offer. That's Underdog Fantasy, promo code Quiche. This then leads up to a Fight Night main event against Brandao in Dublin, where he beat him up and finished him in the first round, and had Conor developing this boogeyman aura, which led to him fighting Dustin Poirier, who was looked at as the boogeyman before. And he was Conor's first real test, and Conor said he was going to bounce his head off the canvas, and he did just that. And Dustin was a real killer back then too. He had already beat Max once, and these were the times when Dustin was cutting from 180 to get to featherweight. All of that for Conor to knock him out in the first round. And yeah, Dustin did go on his anime training arc after this and learn to grow hair and grab his shorts every 2 seconds, but this was a pivotal moment in both of their careers because it led to Conor fighting Dennis Seaver in Boston, the Irish hub of America, and Dustin obviously moved up and became interim champ. Conor then, after fighting Dennis, he got booked against Aldo, which then turned into Mendes, where we saw Conor lose the first round of his career, getting beat up by this roided up monster in Chad Mendes, who was taking Conor down at will and split him open, only for Conor to come back and knock him down and out at the end of the second. And of course, when Conor fought Aldo, I mean, like, come on, like, that's literally some Disney level writing. That is the only thing in UFC history that will get you thinking that there's a script. The amount of stars that aligned for the UFC and Conor, for that to be how that fight went, it honestly seems unreal, especially from the perspective of someone who wasn't watching live back then. This then all leads to Conor losing and getting humbled by Nate, to then bouncing back and beating Nate in a rematch, which we'll get more into later, the importance of that fight and everything that went into it. But we were talking about stories. Their arc is literally straight out of an anime. Nate and Conor was the most insane thing that could ever have happened to the UFC. And of course, all of that led to Conor versus Eddie, where we saw to this day the greatest performance in UFC history, where Conor didn't get touched and obliterated Eddie in the second round. Now you could argue maybe Jon Jones had a better title performance against Cyril. I don't even know if Cyril was trying to win. And the other one you can throw in there is Garbrandt versus Cruz, which is honestly pretty fair. But that rerun of Conor's run just proves that his fights were on another level of excitement that no one can match. And even nowadays, there's exciting fighters, but I think Conor's charisma and the storylines that were added to those knockouts in his fights made it all the more impressive and all the more bigger. So before we get to his charisma, we got to get into the storylines because some of this is just too good to be true. But before we get there, if you're enjoying this video, if you could leave a like and subscribe, I would really appreciate it. appreciate it, and let's get to it. So in terms of storylines, he's entering the UFC as double champ of Cage Warriors, and he's talking brash from the beginning, but that's not uncommon. But for some reason, there was a little bit something extra. Maybe it was the accent or the fake suits and watches he was wearing, but there was just a strong aura of confidence around Conor that's really uncommon in today's fighters. And if it is there, it's like Ilya or Makhachev, and the language barrier just makes it so it doesn't really translate that well. But for Conor to be able to do that and win the first couple fights in the fashion he did, it made you know that there was actually something there. And I think Paddy shows why fights are so important, because Paddy talks like Conor, but based off his performances, you can tell at his current capabilities, he's probably not beating anyone in the top 5 yet anyways. But for Conor to come in and deliver, it led him to have this aura of invincibility, which then got built on with the UFC Fight Night in Dublin, which had the added promo because he was the main event and it really captured an entire nation. I would imagine that fight against Brandao brought in Irish fans who weren't even aware of MMA all of a sudden to have a real interest in the sport and get behind their guy. And for him to win in the fashion he did in all the interviews he gave before and after definitely ensured that the entire country of Ireland was behind him and aware of him. For this to all build into Conor vs Dustin, which was built up as Conor's first real test and Dustin to be the first fighter to really go at Conor. All of the footage of the build-up of this should be somewhat fresh in your mind because they spammed it all over Conor vs Dustin 2 and 3. They really hated each other at this point and created iconic clips from press conferences to seeing each other in the lobby that all of a sudden a lot of people took interest in the fight, and people that may not have heard of Conor, or if they did, they didn't really know much about him, they all of a sudden cared. And Conor going out there and doing exactly what he said he was going to do only built up his persona even more, and to send him straight from there to the TD Garden as a Fight Night main event was the perfect decision because he went out there and did the same thing. And yeah, history doesn't remember Dennis Seaver at all, nor the fight, because it was a pretty standard stoppage, but that slot alone being the main event of another Fight Night secured Conor as one of the biggest stars in the UFC, which led to him versus Aldo, which had one of the top 5 buildups in UFC history, where they went on the world tour and went on dozens of talk shows and really promoted the fight like crazy, only for Aldo to pull out and Conor to accept the Chad fight for the interim title. But all of this stood for what a legit and badass fighter Conor was. Not many people would accept a last minute replacement, much less a replacement for a title fight, and going from a striker to a roided up wrestler, Conor did something that fans recognized him for and actually got hit with adversity too in the fight, only to overcome it, got him a lot of hardcore fans at that point. And all of that leading up to him versus Aldo, which saw the undefeated champion of 10 years, Jose Aldo, going up against the best up and coming fighter since Jon Jones. Everything pointing to Jose Aldo going up there and beating Conor in pretty easy fashion, only for Conor to go out there and win in 13 seconds. That's something that still carries Conor's legacy to this day, because knocking out Jose Aldo of all people in 13 seconds is something that was completely unheard of, and even since then, nothing like that has come close to happening to Aldo. Yeah, he lost to Max a couple times, but still, 13 seconds to the undefeated champion. Even Ilya couldn't manage that, Sean O'Malley couldn't manage that. To this day, that's probably the biggest staple of Conor's career even now. But honestly, I think Nate vs Conor is even more important than Conor vs Aldo. Although Conor vs Aldo captured the view of everyone in combat sports, Nate vs Conor is a rivalry that captured the view of the whole world. You see the pristine Conor who came to the press conferences in suits and had this elitist fight style, to Nate Diaz who pulled up in a black t-shirt, refused to cut to 155, and had the dirtiest fighting style of all time. And for the press conferences to be Conor speaking fluently and clearly, and Nate who could barely speak English at all. It created one of the most dynamic fight buildups of all time, and between getting slots on Fox News and every media outlet on the planet, people cared. And for Nate to go out there and beat up Conor and force him to shoot only to get submitted, one of the best post-fight speeches of all time, which then led to Conor giving one of the most humble post-fight speeches of all time, only made the second fight an even bigger spectacle that even more people cared about, that led to an even bigger buildup to fighting between the camps. It was the perfect storm for a mega event, and the fight went exactly as it would in any story, with Conor getting advantages early, to Nate taking over in the middle of the fight, to Conor having to dig deep and overcome his fatigue, to pulling out a split decision victory. Everything led to what would be the biggest event in UFC history for a long time, and the biggest moment of their respective careers. And when you break down Conor torturing Eddie and knocking him out in a picture-perfect performance, it almost seems like an afterthought to Nate vs Conor. But I think at the moment Conor beat Eddie, everyone knew that Conor was that guy, and it really seemed like nothing was going to happen to him. Between the double champ post-fight speech, it was was pretty clear that Conor had options whether he wanted to fight Tyron Woodley or do what he actually did, and you may be wondering why I haven't mentioned it at this point, but it's the big elephant in the room, and of course it is Conor versus Floyd. And this is where charisma really took over, because although Conor won a couple rounds, I think everyone knew he was going to lose, but the eyes on the press conferences were huge and the spectacle was just something to behold, with Conor never freezing up and delivering huge moments at these conferences. And there was a slight narrative at the time that MMA fighters were these crazy monsters that could beat up anyone, beat up any boxer. I think it expanded to the point where someone said Ronda Rousey could outbox Floyd, which is, you know, something, I guess. But Conor taking advantage of that moment led to him blowing up and people wanting to see him come back to MMA, which he did against Khabib. And although he lost, he was acting extremely dark in the press conferences, and I think a lot of people who don't really care about fighting saw the clips of Conor acting like a madman and actually took interest in the sport, because that's how dark things actually got. And the crazy turn of the event as a whole, leading to a brawl after the fight, whether you like it or not, all of that led to Conor becoming a bigger and bigger superstar on a level that cannot be comprehended, something that cannot be replicated, and no other superstar has touched even remotely what he has. And he's blown up the careers of both Khabib, Dustin, and Nate, and without him, the UFC would undoubtedly be in a much different position than it is today. So if you enjoyed this video, check out how losing destroys a fighter's legacy, and leave a like, subscribe, and don't forget, we're just getting started, we're going to stay consistent, and I'll see you in the next video.